Hi again then guys, and welcome to of course the second individual review for a car from the 1.38 selection, and this one for many people was their most anticipated of all five, even over something as monstrous as the Porsche 962, which of course we reviewed yesterday and you should check that out if you haven't already. This one though is a car that a ton of people have been clamouring over and requesting for literally months in the world of GT Sport. It's always, or pretty much always at least, been a part of the Gran Turismo franchise in virtually every game, and it's a car which, thanks to pop culture, thanks to its raw ability at stuff like drifting, on a budget especially, and it's something of a sleeper you could kind of say, it's a car that does have many fans. And of course we have technically looked at this car before. It might have even been like the second episode of this series, in fact, Import Nights, my JDM review series in the world of Gran Turismo. But revisiting the car now in a new game, of course a lot of things can change. Now the thing about the AE86 is, for me, for a start, this is not even my preferred version of the car. I prefer the Corolla with the fixed headlights. I think it just looks that little bit better for me. That's the one I always would use if I had the option, for instance in GT6, but even then they're not among my favourite cars. So the problem, I think, the single biggest problem in fact with JDM culture and JDM fans is that they tend to be, I'm going to be honest with you, pretty bullheaded about these things. Once they decide that they collectively love a car, they tend to be completely deaf to any discussion to the contrary. And to some degree, a lot of petrol heads do that about what they love, but I have no time for that on the channel. I don't do that myself when it comes to the cars that I love. I'm open to admitting that they have downsides, for instance, that they're not the best thing out there. I just happen to like them. Whereas with JDM fans, I'm sure you've come across some at least who are kind of, well, literal fans, fanatics about it. This is one of the perfect examples of that. Is it a bad car? No, it's a great drifter, it's a great budget performance car, and it's even a pretty good sleeper. Whereas to the average Joe, it just kind of looks like an old Japanese hatchback, and you can use that to your advantage. But the pedestal that people put this on makes it seem, well, like a lot more than it is. It's a 127 horsepower car. That's not bad, it's better than they'd probably expect it to be, but it's not exactly going to break records. The weight is 940 kilos, which is very good. That's less than a Fiat Panda 100 HP, for example. The torque is actually, I would say, more impressive than the power. 109 pound-feet is pretty thumpy in comparison to the amount of power that it has, and that's only from a 1.6 naturally aspirated engine. Now, of course, a number of the other versions of this generation became front-wheel drive, or were front-wheel drive already, whereas this one remained rear-wheel drive to keep that sports factor alive for the fans. And of course a ton of people are happy about that, because if this car had undergone that one simple change from Toyota to be, instead of rear-wheel drive, front-wheel drive, history would be completely different. This car would be probably still hugely popular, but not for any of the same reasons. It would be probably popular in a similar way to stuff like the EK Civic or the Toyota Starlet, another two perfect examples of cars that people go absolutely nuts for. And for good reason. It's a great little car, again, don't get me wrong, it's just not exactly a kind of car that gets me going in the same way that it does other people. That doesn't mean that I can't objectively review it though. So what is it good for, and maybe what is it not so good for? Well, with a price tag of 25 grand, it's good value, I will say that. It's a great little N100 car. It's not the fastest of things in a straight line, even in N100, but the cornering is very good. Now, taking it in testing, it compares very well even against stuff like the Classic Mini, which doesn't sound like much of a comparison, but the Classic Mini is a fantastic car for average speed through corners. It's so compact and so lightweight that you don't really have to back off the throttle that much. This, in comparison, is a much heavier, significantly larger vehicle, so you would safely assume that it wouldn't be quite as sharp. But it's still very good, and of course that's part of why it's famous, not just the drifting, but also the, I believe it's Touge or Tauga, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce it, but the kind of canyon style driving that Need for Speed Carbon tried to have, but didn't really, that again Initial D made it famous for. that kind of mix of drifting but performance. Drifting to improve your times, in effect, rather than just to look good. For that kind of stuff, it is great. And of course, earlier on today, I did a brief drift tune for it. It takes very little tuning for this car to get its tail out and hold it there really, really well. And because of the fact that it's drift happy from a relatively small amount of power, I would actually say it's a really good beginner's drift car, because if you try and take out something like the Subaru, the Turn 14 BRZ, that thing's an absolute monster, and you have to, in effect, like detune it to make it easier to drift if you're not an absolute, full-on drifting all the time kind of player. Whereas for the average Joe like me, perhaps you who drifts occasionally rather than all the time, this is more our speed. Something that you can jump in, get sideways, have some fun if you want to, but you're not necessarily the kind of person who's going to drift all the time. It's just one of your interests, not your only interest, for instance, and not even your primary one. So across the board, I think that a car like this, in funnily enough a similar way to other cars that I personally do love, is a car that cannot be fully appreciated in a game, because a lot of the things that make it so popular and so good in the real world don't fully apply here. And some things can be translated, but not fully, like the driver feedback, the fun factor. Of course, it's a fun game, but it doesn't really compare to actually drifting in one in real life. And of course that could apply to any car, but as I said, with some cars, you can feel that, definitely more than others. You need to experience the vehicle for real, if possible, rather than just virtually. Whereas something like, for instance, the Porsche 962, very few people will ever get the chance to drive one, so having it in the game is about as good as it's going to get for most of us. Whereas for something like this, some people do buy them, some people do own them, plenty of people in fact, so it has that more real-world appeal that a lot of other cars that get added to the game simply don't have. And from that point of view, that's probably my single most liked thing about the AE86. Not so much the car itself, but what it represents. This was what Gran Turismo 2 was all about. These more street-level, realistic machines, in effect, cars that you could see all the time, especially if you lived in Japan, cars that were more daily drivers, more affordable, sometimes even junior or youth-oriented cars. Less power, but great performance for their power. This is a prime example of it. It's a hero of that kind of genre, that kind of scene, and it is an icon for a reason. It's not just a pop culture icon, unlike, as I referenced in my overarching review, the DeLorean, for instance, or the Pontiac Trans Am, I believe it was, that was used for Knight Rider, where they're actually not very good cars comparatively. They're just famous because of the movies and shows that they were in. This one's not the same. It actually is a really good car. It's just a car that, if you heard the hype around it, you'd probably think it had something like 1,000 horsepower hiding under the hood, where the reality is that's not why people love it so much. Overall though, it's a good car, and I'm interested to see now where the community demands, if you will, or at least requests, shift to. I have my suspicions that it will probably move to the Nissan Silvia now, because we tend to move from one JDM request to the next, and when that one's added, we move on to the new one. So we'll have to wait and see, but I suspect the Nissan Silvia will be the new car that everyone starts clamouring for within the JDM community. But that's it for my thoughts. Of course, check out my drift tune for the car if you haven't already, and for now, as always, thanks for watching.